Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Making Sense of Nonsense, The Logical Bridge Between Science and Spirituality, by Raymond Moody, M.D., Ph.D. Narrated by Jonathan Yen. I thank God that He lets me be an atheist. C.G. Lichtenberg. Is there life after death? Is a nonsense question, but people will not stop asking it. Raymond Moody. The slowsy begunners floofed in tarkly from below in their cluttering, plaguering flutydopters. Wherever you come near the human race, there's layers and layers of nonsense. Thornton Wilder, Our Town. Introduction. To appreciate nonsense requires a serious interest in life. Frank Gillette Burgess. Since 1965, I have interviewed thousands of people about their profound near-death experiences. In 1975, I published Life After Life, a book about my research, which sold more than 20 million copies all around the world. So I am known to the public mainly as a psychiatrist who studies life after death. Life after death is among the biggest questions of human existence, and many people take the subject very seriously, for it touches on strong, deep, heartfelt feelings that affect almost everybody. Why, then, they ask me, did you write this book about nonsense? Nonsense and the idea of a life after death may seem far, far apart. In reality, however, you can't have one without the other. Nonsense turns out to be the missing piece that always, before, blocked serious investigation of the afterlife. This book supplies the missing piece in the form of a new way of thinking about things that are nonsensical and unintelligible. Therefore, this book is also a major breakthrough on genuine rational inquiry into life after death. Let me explain. When I was a child, my favorite subject was astronomy, and my favorite authors were Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll. I spent lots of my free time gazing through a telescope and reading Alice in Wonderland and Horton Hears a Who. As a budding astronomer, I soon realized that the universe we live in doesn't make perfect sense. For instance, what size is the universe? Surely it comes to an end somewhere, in some kind of wall. But doesn't there have to be something on the other side of a wall? The only other possibility, though, seems to be that the universe goes infinitely into outer space, with no end, and that makes no sense either. When I was about 8 years old, I realized that we live enclosed in a shimmering sphere of unintelligible nonsense. Meanwhile, Dr. Seuss, Edward Lear, and Lewis Carroll convinced me that nonsense is something truly wonderful. We are not confined to saying meaningful things like, "The dog is sleeping peacefully by the fire," or "This hat costs $30," or "The moon is 240,000 miles from the earth." We can also say things like, "Those 5 spumsy chattelers almost plittered that little flifster into monunction," or "Holiness numerically sings the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity," or "That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county." When I was about 12 years old, I realized that there are different types of nonsense, which later turned out to be a pivotal realization that shaped my thinking about near-death experiences. It served me well when I went to college and majored in philosophy, too, for nonsense is a core concept of Western philosophy, especially modern analytic philosophy. It was as a philosophy major reading Plato that I first encountered near-death experiences. Early Greek philosophers understood full well that people sometimes report spiritual experiences when they are revived from close calls with death. Plato wrote about the famous case of a soldier who apparently died in battle, but spontaneously revived at his funeral. The soldier told amazed spectators that he had left his body and went through a passageway into another world. Plato thought that such accounts indicated a transcendent world beyond death. Another Greek philosopher, Democritus, thought differently about experiences like those. Democritus had figured out that things in the world are composed of minute, indivisible particles, atoms, that are too small to be seen. Democritus wrote that the experiences of people who recovered from apparent death were caused by residual biological activity in the body. He said that there is no such thing as a moment of death. Dying is a process. The debate about near-death experiences has not progressed much since then. Some claim that near-death experiences are evidence of life after death. Others claim that the experiences result from oxygen deprivation to the brain. This book explodes that old framework of debate by setting out an entirely new way of thinking. Specifically, this book solves the primary problem that previously prevented real advances toward answering the question of life after death. David Hume, 1711 to 1776, was a renowned philosopher who refined our concepts of causation and inductive reasoning. His famous skeptical works helped shape what we know as the scientific mind. In an incisive analysis, Hume pinpointed the real problem of inquiring into the afterlife. Hume said, "By the mere light of reason it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic." Hume was right. In reality, we can't solve the afterlife problem with the logic we have and the mind we have. The logic you are using right now as you listen to this is based on literal meaning. In that logic, there is life after death is a self-contradiction. After all, death just means the final, irreversible cessation of life. Hence, saying that there is life after the final, irreversible cessation of life is just meaningless. This book solves Hume's problem by setting out a new logic, a logic of nonsense. Learning these new rational principles will actually activate previously hidden powers of your mind. At the end of this book, all these new logical principles and new powers of the mind will come together. Then we will be able to shine astonishing new light on life after death and other big questions of science and religion. After a stint as a philosophy professor, I went to medical school. I soon noticed that patients who were delirious, intoxicated, psychotic, severely stressed, or confused often talked nonsense. Moreover, when ill patients talked nonsense involuntarily, they talked the same types of nonsense that authors like Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll wrote deliberately. That is, nonsense is nonsense, whether it is deliberate or involuntary. Eventually, I brought together all I had learned into a semester-length university course on nonsense, which I taught numerous times. Students learned about the many important psychological and spiritual effects of nonsense, and the many roles nonsense plays in humor, songs, advertising, literature, religion, and the quest for knowledge. My students learned to recognize more than 70 different types of nonsense, describe their structures, and write their own examples. Similarly, here you will learn about the nature of nonsense, its various forms, and why it is important. From there, we'll consider deep connections between nonsense and the mind, to bring the hidden, unconscious world of nonsense fully into your conscious mind and better understand both the rules it follows and the rules it breaks. You'll also learn about the spiritual significance of nonsense and how it has appeared historically in sacred texts, ritual and magical practices, and tradition for inducing transcendent or mystical states of consciousness. Next, we'll review the relationships between nonsense and our search for rational knowledge. In addition, we'll consider the important topic of misuses of nonsense and how it is sometimes used for manipulation and selfish purposes. And finally, with a clear foundation of nonsense set, we'll review the fascinating topic of how it plays a role in our understanding of life after death. The students in my university course also completed nonsense exercises as part of their practice, which awakened unknown cognitive and creative powers of their minds. The exercises I designed for my courses are reprinted throughout Chapter 2 in this book for your own practice. By completing them, you will find that you are able to think logically and creatively about questions that previously eluded reason, and you will attain a revolutionary new understanding of the mysteries of the next life. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Nature of Nonsense. Nonsense is not a vacuity of sense. It is a parody of sense, and that is the sense of it. T.S. Eliot. Nonsense is spoken, written, or signed language that is unintelligible because it is meaningless. That is the primary meaning of the term as it appears in standard dictionaries. Nonsense, to be nonsense, must be language, it must be unintelligible, and it must be meaningless. All three are necessary to fit the definition. Nonsense is, first, language. We should not be misled by the common expression, "Stop your nonsense." Saying, "Stop your nonsense," signals the speaker's strong disapproval of another person's nonverbal, extralinguistic behavior. Nonverbal behavior, since it is not language, is not nonsense in the dictionary meaning of the term. For example, admonishing subordinates for their nonverbal actions and extralinguistic misbehavior is only a secondary, extended use of the word nonsense. Nonsense is, secondly, unintelligible. Saying that something is unintelligible means that it cannot be comprehended by the intellect. In other words, something that is unintelligible is beyond the reach of the intellectual or rational mind. We cannot wrap our minds around something that is unintelligible. For language to be nonsense, then, it must be unintelligible. Sometimes people say that something is unintelligible because they personally cannot comprehend it. People who cannot speak Chinese, for example, might sometimes say that Chinese is unintelligible. By saying that, though, they are acknowledging a personal limitation, specifically an inability to speak Chinese. Generally, they know full well that Chinese is a meaningful language that is intelligible to the people who speak it. People may sometimes talk loosely and say, for example, that the writing in an old faded letter is unintelligible. By saying that, they would mean only that time obliterated so much of the original writing that the message cannot be recovered. Or they might mean that the writer's penmanship is so terrible that the writing is illegible and the message unreadable. Generally, though, they would assume that there was a meaningful message in the letter when the writer originally wrote it. Nonsense, however, is language that is unintelligible because it is, thirdly, meaningless. In other words, nonsense is language that does not make sense because the words or sentences do not fit together to convey a coherent meaning. In sum, then, nonsense is meaningless, unintelligible language. Now, I want to make something crystal clear from the very beginning about the word meaningless. Specifically, nonsense is meaningless only in the context of its linguistic meaning, for nonsense is deeply meaningful to people in a multitude of ways. Nonsense plays important roles in children's literature, music, psychology, religion, and the spiritual life. This book is full of instances of the rich meanings nonsense has for us in those dimensions of our lives. Nonsense lacks linguistic meaning, to be sure, but a linguistic meaning is something we can look up in a dictionary. The other rich meanings nonsense has for us are found in our hearts and minds and souls. Therefore, whenever I say that nonsense is meaningless, I am referring only to its lack of a linguistic dictionary meaning. Throughout this book, we will celebrate how meaningful nonsense is in our lives, while fully understanding it is devoid of linguistic meaning. Nonsense can be deliberate or involuntary. People sometimes write or talk nonsense on purpose. They include, for example, nonsense poets or other writers who create nonsense as an art form. Those writers work deliberately and diligently to produce entertaining or aesthetically pleasing works that are meaningless and unintelligible. People also sometimes deliberately talk nonsense for fraud or imposture. In 2014, a fake sign language interpreter stood beside President Obama on the speaker's platform at the Memorial for Nelson Mandela. As the president and other dignitaries spoke, the impostor flapped his arms and gesticulated wildly in what was supposedly sign language for the deaf. Yet deaf people who watched could not make sense of what the sign language interpreter was saying. The impostor's entire interpretation was meaningless nonsense. An expert on sign language said that the impostor's hand positions were meaningless. The expert also pointed out that the impostor did not use facial expressions, head movements, shoulder raising, or other body language considered integral elements of signing. Authorities were unable to determine how the fake interpreter got through security to talk nonsense next to the President of the United States. Other times, people talk nonsense involuntarily. That is, they talk nonsense without intending to. In other words, they sometimes lapse unknowingly into saying something that is meaningless and unintelligible. For example, people sometimes talk nonsense involuntarily because of a certain medical or psychological condition. Specifically, people who are psychotic, delirious, intoxicated, asleep, or having a stroke or a migraine sometimes talk unintelligible nonsense involuntarily. People sometimes talk nonsense without intending to, simply because of a conceptual confusion. That is, they unwittingly get concepts mixed up, and hence they say something that is meaningless and unintelligible. Nonsense that comes from conceptual confusion occurs in people from all walks of life. For example, a highly successful coach once said to his team, "You guys line up alphabetically by height." Nonsense that results from inadvertent conceptual confusion is of particular interest to analytic philosophers. Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and Gilbert Ryle were among early analytic philosophers who argued that many traditional philosophical problems are meaningless, unintelligible nonsense. That was the central tenet of analytic philosophy. Now, people who talk nonsense because of a physical or mental illness are often in a clouded state of consciousness. People who talk nonsense when they are half asleep, delirious, or crazy, for example, are not fully alert and may be only semi-conscious. They may talk nonsense from within a strange, dreamlike state in which they are unable to draw distinctions. In that state, they cannot think logically or coherently. In contrast, people who are working on philosophical problems are typically fully alert and in a lucid state of consciousness. Philosophical questions are difficult and tricky to begin with, though, and it is easy for even careful, logical thinkers to get confused. When their conceptual confusions are pointed out to them, they usually realize that they were talking nonsense and adjust their thinking. In contrast, delirious, intoxicated, or psychotic patients cannot comprehend that they are talking nonsense, nor can they adjust their thinking. Nonsense can be deliberate or involuntary, and involuntary nonsense is common in hospitals, especially psychiatric hospitals. Doctors and nurses working in those settings frequently hear their patients talking nonsense involuntarily. Far more people are out and about than are working in hospitals, though, and those people are far more likely to hear or read nonsense that someone created deliberately, usually for entertainment or artistic purposes. Nonsense is predominantly a recreational and literary form of language. The nonsense that most Americans hear or read most frequently was written for use in play, recreation, entertainment, literature, and songs. Nonsense is common in children's oral literature, such as nursery rhymes, jump rope rhymes, and riddles. Popular children's authors who are famous for their nonsense writings include Edward Lear, Lewis Carroll, Dr. Seuss, Quentin Blake, and Shel Silverstein. Authors such as Alfred Jarry and Samuel Beckett wrote surrealistic nonsense that provoked philosophical discussion among adult readers and theater audiences. To summarize, then, nonsense is a genre of oral and written literature for children and adults. The next chapter will give specific examples of nonsense from all of the mentioned authors. Later, we will refer to some examples of nonsense from popular forms of music, too, for nonsense is a standard ingredient of certain kinds of songs, including traditional ballads, scat singing, and doo-wop. Nonsense in entertainment, recreation, play, poetry, and song is ubiquitous in modern American society. Moreover, those are the settings in which Americans most frequently encounter nonsense, and therefore, for them, nonsense is a thoroughly pleasant experience. Still, people hardly ever think about all of the positive nonsense that they take in as nonsense. Strangely, it never occurs to them that, for instance, lines in popular songs they like to listen to are nonsense. Although nonsense they hear and read almost always affects them positively, and they like it, they seldom think of it as nonsense. In fact, the word nonsense has a strongly negative effect on them. Nonsense itself affects people positively, but the word nonsense affects people negatively. That is, people like nonsense itself, but they dislike the word nonsense. People do not associate the many good effects they enjoy from deliberate nonsense with the word nonsense. Instead, they associate the word nonsense with one common negative effect of involuntary nonsense, specifically errors. Nonsense is predominantly a pejorative term of criticism and debate. Nonsense sometimes indicates a cognitive failure. Delirious, psychotic, or intoxicated people, as already noted, talk nonsense involuntarily because they have difficulty with cognitive processing. People whose cognitive processes are fully intact may, nonetheless, talk nonsense inadvertently because of mixing incompatible concepts. For example, a football coach once said to his players, "You guys pair up in threes." In other words, talking nonsense without intending to is sometimes a sign of cognitive impairment due to organic illness, or somebody may talk nonsense unintentionally because of misunderstanding concepts. Talking nonsense is a kind of error in both cases. Accordingly, people naturally associated talking nonsense with errors, and they then use the word nonsense pejoratively to denounce something somebody else said. Nonsense, unintelligible, and meaningless are stock terms of criticism in serious scientific, academic, and religious debate. Saying, "That is nonsense," is an accepted way of objecting to new ideas that are put forward for rational inquiry. Objecting that an idea is unintelligible or meaningless or nonsensical is a common ploy in learned debate as well as in public discourse. In fact, the word nonsense occurs most frequently within the context of debate and disputation. The following selection of quotations will illustrate how common this kind of objection is. The upcoming examples are typical of many others that anyone could find. They are common in news magazines, newspapers, academic works, and science publications. Squeezing light. The very idea seems nonsensical. How do you grab something as intangible as light and throttle it down to something smaller? Understanding how this is possible goes to the heart of what we now know light to be. Sidney Perkowitz. People often criticize discussions of multiple universes as meaningless because we can't detect whether they actually exist. Anthony Aguirre. Infinity mathematics to me is something that is meaningless because it is abstract nonsense. We have to kick the misleading word undecidable from the mathematical lingo, since it tacitly assumes that infinity is real. We should rather replace it with the phrase, not even wrong. In other words, utter nonsense. Doran Zeilberger. Some researchers believe that by writing and then editing our own stories, we can change our perceptions of ourselves and identify obstacles that stand in the way of better health. It may sound like self-help nonsense, but research suggests that the effects are real. Some people might think of miracles as particular juxtapositions of events, each of which has a correct and acceptable scientific explanation. This might be nonsensical, but it would be interesting to discover wherein the nonsense lies. Hugh McLaughlin. Evidently, dismissing somebody's ideas as unintelligible nonsense is an accepted technique of raising an objection in rational debate. Objections that some proposed idea is nonsense have been raised and debated in physics, cosmology, philosophy, mathematics, religious studies, medicine, and economics. The previous quotations are enough to tell us a lot about the use of nonsense in rational argumentation and disputation. Ancient Greek philosophers who founded rational thought dubbed ideas nonsense as a way of rejecting them and setting them aside. That way of arguing against inconvenient ideas or claims is still standard practice in the pursuit of knowledge. Furthermore, objecting that an unfamiliar notion is unintelligible nonsense is treated as though it were a powerful argument. After all, if a claim is unintelligible, there is nothing there in the way of content that can be investigated by rational methods. Theoretically, then, demonstrating that somebody's idea or position is unintelligible nonsense should put a stop to rational inquiry into the matter. When raising this kind of objection, people use nonsense and unintelligible and meaningless as interchangeable terms. Yet, despite the presumed authority and finality of proving that an idea is unintelligible and nonsensical, this form of argument has a poor track record. For centuries, scoffers have greeted revolutionary new thoughts and theories by saying that they are unintelligible or nonsensical. There are no explicit public rules and procedures that govern accusing someone of talking nonsense or defending one's own position against such an accusation. That is shocking, too, given that arguing that way is such a widespread, accepted practice in serious scientific, academic, and religious discussions. Why is such a startling departure from rigorous, rational standards allowed in this case? Different individuals may disagree about whether or not a particular idea is unintelligible. One person may say that the idea is unintelligible nonsense, while another person says that the idea makes perfect sense. Yet because there are no public, agreed-upon rules governing these arguments, there is no standard rational method for resolving disagreements about unintelligibility. We need a standard criterion for identifying.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?